So, I want to talk to you about Infidel, which is this. No, don't go away. I assure you it will be interesting. So, Infidel is the memoir of Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and it's a really good book. I really recommend going out to your library and checking it out. It's so interesting. It's really eye-opening. I'm going to read excerpts from the book, and sometimes I'll just leave it and not talk about it because it won't need to be talked about, or I will talk about some parts. The scissors went down between my legs, and the man cut off my inner labia and clitoris. I heard it, like a butcher snipping the fat off of a piece of meat. A piercing pain shot up between my legs, indescribable, and I howled. Then came the sewing. The loud, blunt needle clumsily pushed into my bleeding outer labia, my loud and anguished protest. Grandma's words of comfort and encouragement. It is just this once in your life, Ayaan. Be brave, he's almost finished. When the sewing was finished, the man cut the thread off with his teeth. That was a bit talking about her mutilation done to her when she was 5 years old. Her little sister had the same thing done, but afterward, Hueya was never the same afterward. She became ill with fever for several weeks and lost a lot of weight. She had horrible nightmares, and during the day began stopping off to be alone. My once cheerful, playful little sister had changed. Sometimes she just stared vacantly at nothing for hours. We all started wetting our beds after the circumcision. They were wetting the beds because your legs are tied together when you have this female circumcision, though it's just mutilation. I don't like to use the word circumcision when talking about it because that does not do it justice. Your legs are tied together so they can't move and rip out the stitches. When a female is circumcised, like I had been described, it's all sewn up except for a tiny little hole where pee and later period blood comes out. On September 16th, 1978, there was an eclipse of the moon in Riyadh. Late one afternoon, it became visible. A dark shadow moving slowly across the face of the pale moon in a darkening blue sky. There was a frantic knocking on the door. When I opened it, our neighbor asked if we were safe. He said it was the day of judgment, when the Quran says the sun will rise from the west and the seas will flood, when all the dead will rise and all his angels will weigh our sins and virtues, expediting the good to paradise and the bad to hell. Though it was barely twilight, the muezzin suddenly called for prayer, not one mosque calling carefully after the other, as they usually did, but all the mosques clamoring all at once all over the city. They were shouting across the neighborhood. When I looked out, I saw people praying in the street. Ma called us indoors and said, "Everybody's praying, we should pray." The sky grew dark. It was a sign. Now more neighbors came knocking, asking us to pardon past misdeeds. They told us children to pray for them, because children's prayers are answered most. The gates of hell yawned open before us. We were panicked. By the time I had turned 10, I lived through 3 different political systems, all of them failures. The police state in Mogadishu rationed people into hunger and bombed them into obedience. Islamic law in Saudi Arabia treated half of its citizens like animals with no rights or recourse, disposing of women without regard. And the old Somali rule of the clan, which saved you when you needed refuge, so easily broke down into suspicion, conspiracy, and revenge. In the years to come, clan warfare would sharpen and splinter, and finally tear the whole of Somalia into pieces in one of the most destructive civil wars in Africa. This is about how in high school all the girls were leaving to be married. One after another, girls began announcing they were leaving school to get married. Mostly they told the teachers about it too. It was perfectly respectable. It hadn't occurred to anyone in authority to prevent these children from being taken out of school to marry total strangers, even though most of the girls were reluctant and some of them were petrified. One girl was forced to marry her uncle's son, her cousin. A 15-year-old Yemeni classmate told us she had just been betrothed to a much older man. She wasn't happy about it, but she added, "At least it's not as bad for my sister. She was 12. The Quran lists hell's torments in vivid details. Sores, boiling water, peeling skin, burning flesh, dissolving bowels, the everlasting fire that burns you forever. For your flesh chars and your juices boil, you form a new skin. These details overpower you ensuring that you will obey. The Ma'alim, whose class Huaya and I now attended on Saturdays, used to shake out the taboos and restrictions, the rules to obey, sometimes spitting with the excitement of it. You'll go to hell, and you'll go to hell, and you, unless, just like Oprah, you get a car only, it's you'll go to hell, you'll go to hell. This is when she started thinking more critically about the religion. Something inside of me always resisted the moral values behind Sister Aziza's lectures, a small spark of independence. Perhaps it was my reaction to the stark gap between the behavior demanded by the holy writings and the realities of actual daily life with all its twists and turns. Even as a child, I could never comprehend the downright unfairness of the rules, especially for women. How could a just God, a God so just that almost every page of the Quran praises his fairness, desire that women be treated so unfairly? When the Ma'alim told us the woman's testimony is worth half than a man's, I would think, why? If God was merciful, why would he demand that his creatures be hanged in public? If he was compassionate, why did unbelievers go to hell? If Allah was almighty and powerful, why didn't he just make believers out of the unbelievers and have them all go to paradise? The next bit is about more unfairness of women and how they have to cover themselves so not to tempt men. I talked to Sister Aziza and she confirmed it. Women are emotionally stronger than men, she said. They can endure more, so they are tested more. Husbands may punish their wives, not for small infractions like being late, but for major infractions like being provocative to other men. This is just because of the overwhelming sexual power of women. I asked, what if the man provokes other women? Sister Aziza said, in Islamic society, this is not possible. Okay, this part is all about how us women are just so crazy sexy that if men see any part of us, they go insane and rape us because we're just so damn sexy. Some scholars held that the eyes of women were the strongest source of sexual provocation. When the Quran said women should lower the gaze, it actually meant they should hide their eyes. Another school of thought held that the very sight of a woman's lips, especially full ones that were firm and young, could bring a man into a sexual state that could cause his downfall. Yet other thinkers spent pages and pages on the sensual curve of the chin, a pretty nose, or long, slender fingers, and the tendency of women to move their hands in a way that attracted attention to their temptations. For every limitation, the Prophet was quoted. Women often told her, which is the Sister Aziza who would teach religious classes to the girls, women often told her how horrible it was for them to have sex. Sister Aziza used to respond they were complaining only because they had read licentious, un-Islamic descriptions of sexual experiences in Western books. We Muslim women were not to copy the behavior of unbelievers. We shouldn't dress like them, or make love like them, or behave like them in any way. We should not read their books, for that would lead us off the straight, true path of Allah. Can enjoy sex, because that's not the Islamic way, and can't read books written by Westerners, because that'll make you basically an infidel. Awesome. No wonder there's no education in Islamic countries. They said women were in a grip of invisible forces that played with their minds and made them switch from one extreme mood to another. That is why Allah had ordained that the testimony of 2 women is required to that of 1 man, and why women should not be allowed to govern or accept public offices. For leadership requires mindful contemplation and judgments reached after careful thought. Women lacked all these by nature. We were filthy and irrational, and it was much better for us if our fathers and other male guardians decided who we spend the rest of our lives with. The next bit is when things were going to shit in Somalia, and she was there because she had been living in Kenya. She was there with a male relative to save other relatives who were trying to come into Kenya. One morning when I went to get water with all the throngs of the women, I heard that a woman had been attacked in the night. She had arrived alone. She was from a small sub-clan. She had no men to protect her. Kenyan soldiers had taken her out of the hut in the night and raped her. I went to see the tiny rag hut she had made for herself. She was one big wound. Her face was swollen and covered in dried blood. Her Her clothes were torn and there were marks all over her legs. She was shaking uncontrollably. I touched her hand and asked if I could help, but she didn't talk. All she could was say, Ya Allah, Ya Allah. Allah, have mercy on me. I went to get more water, and all the people nearby told me, You shouldn't be seen with that woman. She is impure. People will say you are the same. All I could see was a human being who had been abused, was on the verge of death, but to them, she was an outcast. 2 days later, again there was a story of another woman who had been raped. It was happening all the time. Kenyan soldiers came at night to rape Somali women who were left alone without protectors. All these women would be shunned and left to die. This is what grandmother had meant when she warned me. If you're a Somali woman alone, you're like a piece of sheep fat in the sun. Ants and insects crawl over you, and you cannot move or hide. You will be eaten and melted until nothing is left but a thin smear of grease. She had warned us that if it happened, it would be our fault. Most unmarried Somali girls who got pregnant committed suicide. I knew of one girl in Mogadishu who poured a can of gasoline over herself in the living room with everyone there and burned herself alive. Of course, if she hadn't done this, her father and brothers probably would have killed her anyway. In every way, to read these books of Western history was sinning. Even the history of how modern states formed confronted me with the contradictions of my belief in Allah. The European separation of God's word from the state itself was haram. The Quran says there can be no government without God. The Quran is Allah's books of laws for the conduct of worldly affairs. And you can see how well those countries are doing. This was after she had refugeed to Holland. Well, she really ran away from an arranged marriage. She went to school, she learned Dutch, she got a job as a translator. She was doing really well. So this is a story from when she was a translator. One Somali woman was about my age from a rural area. She couldn't read or write Somali or speak a word of Dutch. She had been married in Somalia to a man who had come to visit looking for a wife, who then brought her straight to Holland. She almost never left the apartment on her own. She was frightened of the foreign streets. Her husband beat her. Finally, the police brought her horribly bruised and cut to the women's shelter. This woman was not only homeless in Holland, she could not go back to her family in Somalia either. She told me it was Allah's will. Allah gave me these circumstances, and if I am patient, Allah will remove this misery. Women like this never press charges. The prospect of making their way alone seemed to them impossible. They were convinced that by accepting systematic, really merciless abuse, they were serving Allah and earning a place in heaven. They always went back to their husband. She'd been living in Holland for a while. She was going to university, and she was becoming more aware about the country's policies and such through her work. This compassion for immigrants and their struggles in a new country resulted in attitudes and policies that perpetuated cruelty. Thousands of Muslim women and children in Holland were being systematically abused, and there was no escaping this fact. Little children were excised on kitchen tables. I knew this from Somalis for whom I translated. Girls who chose their own boyfriends and lovers who were beaten half to death or even killed. Many more were regularly slapped around. The suffering of these women was unspeakable, and while the Dutch were generously contributing money to international aid organizations, they were ignoring the silent suffering of women and children in their own backyard. This is after the 9/11 attacks. I found myself thinking that the Quran is not a holy document. It is a historical record written by humans. It is one version of events as perceived by the men who wrote it 150 years after the Prophet Muhammad died. It is a very tribal and Arab version of events. It spreads a culture that is brutal, bigoted, fixated on controlling women, and harsh in war. Surely Islam was some kind of influence in the underperforming segregation of so many immigrants in Holland. As I went on doing research, it became painfully apparent that all of non-Western immigrants in Holland, the least integrated, are Muslims. Among immigrants, unemployment is highest for Moroccans and Turks, the largest Muslim groups, although their average level of skills is roughly the same as all the other immigrant populations. Taken as a whole, Muslims in Holland made disproportionately heavy claims on social welfare and disability benefits and are disproportionately involved in crime. This is about after she became an atheist. I did not feel strong enough to face what would happen if I said out loud that I no longer believed. For a Muslim, to be an apostate is the worst thing possible. Christians can cease to believe in God, and that is a personal matter that affects only their eternal soul. But for a Muslim to cease believing in Allah, that is a lethal offense. Apostates merit death, and on that, the Quran and the Hadith are clear. For a Muslim woman to abjure her faith is the worst kind of disobedience to God, because it comes from the most impure element in society. It cries out for God's punishment. On the BBC, I listened to the news of riots that erupted in Nigeria. A young woman journalist assigned to cover the Miss World competition there had written, Muslims thought it was immoral to bring 92 women to Nigeria to ask them and revel in vanity. What would the Prophet Muhammad think? He probably would have chosen a wife from one of them. More than 200 people were killed in the riots that broke out. The office of her newspaper was burned down, and the reporter was forced to leave the country. Now I listen to a snotty British woman who organized the pageant. Instead of blaming the violence on the men who were burning down houses and murdering people, she blamed the young reporter for making unfortunate remarks. I was incensed by this excusing of fanaticism. The journalist had written nothing wrong. She was right. The Prophet married most of his wives because they caught his eye one way or another. Many well-meaning Dutch people have told me in all earnestness that nothing in Islamic culture incites abuse of women. It is just a terrible misunderstanding. Men all over the world beat their women, I'm constantly informed. In reality, those Westerners are the ones who misunderstand Islam. The Quran mandates these punishments and gives a legitimate basis for abuse so that the perpetrators feel no shame and are not hounded by their conscience or their community. This is the last section I'm going to read. Saudi Arabia is the source of Islam in its quintessence. It is the place where Muslim religion is practiced in the purest form, and it is the origin of much of the fundamentalist vision that, in my lifetime, spread far beyond its borders. In Saudi Arabia, every breath, every step we took was infused with concepts of purity and sinning, and with fear. Wishful thinking about the peaceful tolerance of Islam cannot interpret away this reality. Hands are still cut off, women still stoned and enslaved, just as the Prophet Muhammad decided centuries ago. I really recommend reading this book. I have read a little of her Caged Virgin book, which is a collection of essays. I have read a little bit of that. It's a little bit more academic kind of read, and it's not as, I don't want to call this light reading, but it's very smooth. It's a really well-written memoir, and it's really eye-opening when she's talking about how the different cultures in Africa and the Arab world think, and what she experienced, and how they think. It is think and operate. It is just go get it.